Thank you for downloading from the BBC. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the Forum from the BBC World Service, where continents engage and ideas exchange. Hello, I'm Bridget Kendall, and on today's show, Palestinian philosopher and politician Professor Sari Nusseibeh on the power of political magic to negotiate peace. Radio ecologist Brenda Howard explores the changes in plants and animals after exposure to radiation. And Italian historian of antiquity, Giusto Traina, traces ancient history through a mosaic of multiple realities. Nice to have you here on the Forum. Welcome to you all.
Hello. Hello from Jerusalem.
Professor Sari Nusseibeh, can I come to you first? A philosophical and political thinker from one of the most distinguished Palestinian families. You're a philosopher by training. I think you describe yourself as an educator, president of Al-Quds University in Jerusalem. Yet you're also well known for your political activities. An aspiration very much on people's minds this week, with President Obama bringing together Palestinian and Israeli leaders in New York. And you've suggested that one of the main stumbling blocks in the present Middle East is the inability to imagine the lives of the other, a woeful lack of information about people who often live very close to you. And it's this chasm of misunderstanding that you see as one of the main difficulties. Is that right?
Yes, I think that describes my point of view fairly. I want to preface what I'm going to say actually by also stating that this is not the result of any kind of academic research or scholarly research into the subject. My observations on this are primarily caused or evoked by living the life that I do as a Palestinian under occupation. And, you know, there's a pressing question on my mind always, constantly, which is, how do I make this life better? How can I make it a better life for myself? And there are two ways of looking at it. One way of looking at it is to say the parameters are fixed or prefixed. There are the Israelis on the one side, the Palestinians on the other. The Israelis know what they are up to, what they want. So do the Palestinians. And, you know, either their interests coincide or not. Either reason prevails or not. And if it does, then well and good. People can conclude a settlement, a peaceful agreement. But if not, then that's too bad, and they will continue fighting. That's one way of looking at it. And I believe it's been a dismal failure to look at it this way, to look at the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians this way. And I think that what we need on both sides, not only on the Palestinian side, to break the deadlock is to try and think differently. And one way to think is, in fact, to not to leave reason behind or logic behind, but to take on what I like to call secular faith, or in other words, faith in our human capacity, our human ability to make a difference to our lives, to make life better than it is. And I think this is what, in fact, then leads us on to talking, for instance, about imagination, the power of imagination, imagining what the other person is like, what the other party is like, imagining how life would be different, how life could look after the conflict rather than be imprisoned, so to speak, within the confines of the existing conflict, to look ahead, to look beyond existing reality, to imagine how things could happen, and then to have the hope, the faith, in fact, that you can make that come about, you can make that reality come about. Now, I think there's a difference.
Can I just interrupt here? Because I can see what you're saying there, but it's very hard, isn't it, to get away from the reality, which is that both communities, Israelis and Palestinians, claim the same land, which is surely the nub of the problem.
Well, I mean, let me put it this way. Of course, on the one hand, it's very hard to escape or get out of the fact that one is, as a Palestinian, under occupation. There's constant pressure on Palestinians and so on. On the Israeli side, there's probably also the kind of pressure they live under. But on the other hand, the question is, how does one, manage to get out of it? If you're sticking to your identity as an Israeli, and if you believe that as an Israeli it is not possible to, for instance, compromise with Palestinians, that compromising with Palestinians in a sense negates your identity as an Israeli, then of course you'll never make peace with the Palestinians. And likewise, if on the Palestinian side you think, and you continue to think, this whole land is mine and not going to compromise with the Israelis because compromising with Israelis somehow negates or undermines from my identity as a Palestinian, then this is where, in fact, the conflict cannot be solved, where, in fact, deadlocks can continue to exist. So what I'm suggesting is that one try to look at the matter a little bit differently. And in order to look differently at the matter, you have to imagine the Israeli not as an Israeli that cannot compromise with Palestinians, and you have to look at oneself, one has to look at oneself as a Palestinian, as actually also not necessarily losing one's identity by compromising with Israelis.
But this question of identity, it's a fascinating idea, but it's very drastic, isn't it, to say to somebody that you need to possibly change your identity, if I understand you right? Because often in these negotiations, this is precisely what the negotiations are about, is to protect this. The challenge to an identity can be seen as ultimate betrayal.
What I'm suggesting is that one has to go outside of the box, because very often, in fact, within that box, within the confines of those parameters, sticking to a specific concept of one's own identity or of the identity of the other, in fact, makes it impossible to reach peace. And there's something far more important than being, for instance, or seeing oneself either as an Israeli or as a Palestinian, namely seeing oneself as a human being. And I believe that if one tries to come out of the, so to speak, shell of feeling that one is one or the other, and if one tries to see oneself, and therefore the other also, as primarily a human being, then perhaps thinking outside of the box, as I say, one can in fact come to some kind of settlement or compromise between the two sides.
Okay, let's bring sorry, I know you could go on about this, but I just want to bring in the other two guests here. Listening to you is Brenda Howard, a radio ecologist. Brenda, that's a very different sphere, but what do you think about this question?
Well, I just wondered if Sari felt there was any other examples in the world of how this reconciliation has taken place and what's provoked it. I mean, one idea that comes to mind for me is Northern Ireland, where some of the things that you're talking about seem to have been rather similar over there in terms of two communities that had very fixed views of each other, and how the government actually played a role in moving that forward to where we are now. Do you see any parallels with that?
Yes, I believe that there are parallels in that. There are parallels, I believe, also in everyday life. In other words, we can either look upon the world as consisting of individuals or parties that somehow are prefixed as disposed to be friends or enemies with one another, or we can look at the same space of the world and look at the parties as not having prefixed identities and therefore prefixed identities as friends or enemies, but look at the world as a world in which we can make friends as easily as we can make enemies. We are not born as friends or enemies, but we can make ourselves or others as friends or enemies. And also, by the way, we can lose them.
Let me just bring in, just to try now, because Brenda asked about other examples. You're a historian of late antiquity. You're used to studying this part of the Middle East in a completely different context of the waning Roman Empire. But are there parallels in antiquity that you can see which are helpful here?
Well, so far we have spoken about the contemporary identities, but identity is also made of memory. So my question is, if the Palestinians and the Israeli are going to make an accord about some things, how could be an imaginary museum? Because museum is made also of cartography, is also made of maps.
What do you do about
identities.
The maps? Yeah.
Yes, what do you do? What's your idea?
This comes back to the question of land. Sorry.
Well, I'm not sure if I follow exactly Giusto's suggestion, but if I may, I'd like also to solicit his views on the fact that memories are very often also, in large part, invented. In other words, as one seeks to identify or to articulate an identity, one actually invents. There's a lot of invention in memory, and this is certainly true, for instance, in case of Israel. And likewise, probably on the Arab and the Palestinian side, one invents a memory. And that invention, in fact, goes into the constitution of one's identity.
Okay,
so I go back
Yes.
and say that perhaps, you know, there's a good reason in a situation of conflict like we have today between Israelis and Palestinians, when, you know, looking at life, at how we are living, and looking into the future at how we might be living together, there's a good reason to think again of the memory that we have both inherited, and to sort of articulate it in such a way as to make life bearable for coexistence between the two of us. Because otherwise, if we stick to one-sided kind of memory, maybe we can never then find consistent narratives with which we can live.
There's one thing I wanted to ask you about, which is maybe partly the answer to this, the question of mutual respect. And looking back over your own biography, you've spent time in an Israeli prison. You were known at one time as Arafat's man in Jerusalem, but you've also been famous for joining forces with the former head of Israel's security agency, Shin Bet, and candidate to lead the Israeli Labour Party, to set up a civil initiative to try and advance Palestinian-Israeli coexistence. And a lot of the time you have talked about the key being not actually what you're talking about, but what your deeper attitude is to one another, this question of respect.
Well, respect, you see, comes basically from the ability to imagine oneself as not necessarily confined within the confines of one's pre-given identity. I mean, that's very important. Respect also requires that one is able to see the other for the human beings they are, or for the human being they are. Respect requires that you see them as you see yourself, your ability to see them as you see yourself. And for this to happen, you have to somehow be able to abstract from your own shell. You have to be able to look across the border, so to speak, and to see the other as someone belonging to the same species, having the same inner feelings, emotions. You have to sympathize with the other, their pain, their feelings, and so on, in order to be able to fully respect them. And so it's really connected, I believe, the fact that somehow you have to teach yourself in some ways. Order to...
Let me just stop you there, sorry, because Brenda wants to come in. Brenda Howard.
Sorry, I was just wondering, how do you get to the situation for both Israelis and Palestinians where, you know, not only people like yourself will have respect for the other side, but also normal people living in villages and communities in both countries would you know, be able to have sufficient understanding and empathy with other people, with the others, to actually develop that respect. That seems to me to be possibly more of a problem.
And if I could just add to that, sorry, I suppose a big question is if it's about breaking the deadlock and thinking outside the box, is more useful some sort of breakthrough in some new configuration of something which makes you suddenly see everything differently? Or is the way to go to this long, hard grind which gradually changes opinions and builds trust, maybe builds a bedrock of mutual economic benefits? Because those are two very different things that can happen, as Justo knows from history.
Now, the two approaches. One approach is to sit back and hope that something will happen by itself. For instance, that President Obama or the United Nations or the EU or somebody in power right up at the top, prime ministers, presidents, can make things come about the way that you want them. That's one approach. We've actually tried this, and it's failed, in the sense that for many, many years, people have tried at different levels to make things happen in a different way, and they haven't succeeded. I'm not talking only about the peace process that began at Madrid and Oslo. I'm talking about, you know, years and years of interventions by the United Nations and by superpowers and so on. And again, today we find with President Obama's efforts to make things happen that indeed things are very, very hard, very difficult. So I'm back to the question. I'm asking myself as an ordinary person, as an ordinary Palestinian, indeed even as an ordinary Israeli, might ask themselves the same question. How can we make things different? How can we make life better for us? I can perhaps start a revolution, maybe a military revolution, something like that, something of that kind. That's one way of looking at it. Or I can say I can't do anything. But on the other hand, what I'm suggesting is this. First of all, one has to have faith, not reason, not just be guided by reason. One has to have faith, which is a kind of outgrowth of perhaps another thing, which is hope. Faith that things can be better.
Can I just interrupt you there? Yes, you said this before about faith. Just to end with, I just wanted to ask you a quite concrete question. The landscape politically is quite bleak, not just because of the disposition of power between Israelis and Palestinians, but because the Palestinians themselves are split with Hamas in power in Gaza. So you've long been an advocate of a two-state solution. Have you still got hope in that?
No, wait,
do you think it's conceivable in your lifetime?
Wait. I never said that the problem is the split between Hamas and Fatah. I mean, that's not the problem. That's one of the symptoms of the problem. The problem is the continued occupation. Now, as far as the two-state solution is concerned, I would support the two-state solution, of course, if the two-state solution is a solution that will, in fact, provide me with the kind of life that I wish to live as a human being. But I'm not actually wedded to the two-state solution. I'm not Catholically wedded to the idea of having a national state for the Palestinians in part of Palestine. My primary concern, my primary need as a human being, and I stress again that my point of view is defined by my identification of myself as a human being, primarily, not as a man, not as a Muslim, not as a Palestinian, but as a human being. My primary concern is to live in dignity, to earn and to have the respect that I deserve to have as a human being, just like the Israeli has next door. So I have no problem living in one state. I have no problem living in 2 states, 3 states, 4 states. My main problem is that I want to be able to live a dignified life in equality with fellow citizens in the same political environment.
Okay, so you're saying that... I get the point. So the main thing is to live in dignity. And you said the important thing is more faith than hope. So I ask you again, do you think this could happen in your lifetime?
Of course. My point is that one has to have faith, and with having faith, everything is possible.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Sari Nusseibeh. And I'm reminded of a quote from your father from your memoir, Once Upon a Country, where you say that he often said, "Rubble often makes the best building material." You're listening to The Forum from the BBC World Service. And now time for our 60-second idea, when one of my guests will offer us an idea to try to improve the world and sell it to us, as it were, in 60 seconds. And this week, it's radio ecologist Brenda Howard who's in the hot seat, and your job, Brenda, is to convince me, Bridget Kendall, Palestinian philosopher and politician Professor Sari Nusseibeh, and Italian professor of late antiquity Giusto Traina. So, Brenda, take a deep breath. Off you go.
My problem is with the rapid response world. We have an expectation of a rapid response through modern communication these days. We've moved from snail mail to email, texting, phones, mobiles, supplemented by voicemail, missed calls. We can't escape from this society. We can't escape from all this communication. Many of us continue responding even after we get home at night. We switch on our computers and we carry on responding, even though we know we shouldn't. We need to stop being reactive and become more proactive. If we do that, we'll become more productive. We don't have time nowadays to think and innovate because we're constantly responding to everybody else. What do we need to do? We need to make it unacceptable, not only to have a rapid response, but to expect a rapid response from others as well. What do? Well, we could ban email. We could turn it off for 1 day a week and then get on with thinking about things for a change. We could have a system where we have to wait for 2 days before we respond to anybody. Then we have to think.
Thank you very much, Brenda. And I suppose if we were to take your advice literally, we'd all now have to leave the studio and come back in 2 days' time. But perhaps you'll give us some leeway to respond immediately, because what you're trying to say is we should get away from knee-jerk reactions, yes?
Yeah, I think one of the things I learnt very early on in my working life is if I had an email that annoyed me intensely, write a response, but don't send it. Leave it there for a day. And then you'll always change it before you send it. You feel better having responded, but it's probably not wise to send your first response.
I think probably all of us who inhabit the email world have been there, Brenda. But I must say, gentlemen, round the table, Justa Traina and Sari Nusebi, I'm the journalist here. I'm the one who's most likely to have to turn round ideas for a deadline in an hour or two's time, or possibly much shorter than that in a few minutes on a breaking story, whereas you both are from the academic world. So you should have the leisure of a bit more time to collect and write up your thoughts. So you must sympathise with Brenda that we're all being made to react too quickly. Just a trainer, a historian's view.
It's very difficult to say because, as a matter of fact, I'm an emailaholic in some way. And it can happen several moments in a day to have some passionate reactions. And I think this is just fine.
What about you, Sari Nusebi?
Well, I think, my immediate response is to say that there's a difference, I think, between what Brenda is talking about, the rapid response world, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a speed world, a world in which things happen quickly. Now, I'm for not responding quickly or for responding quickly, depending on whether the answer needs to be responded to quickly. Where I agree with Brenda is in actually giving time for oneself, a day, a week, 2 days a week. And in fact, this is the practice. I mean, having a Sunday, a sabbatical, a Friday, or whatever, in which one can just sit down and think to oneself, and not necessarily in order to become proactive. One can just sit and think and enjoy oneself, because the world, I think, is much larger than having either to respond to it or to produce in it. I mean, the world is also there to be enjoyed, and I think one needs to give oneself at least some time every week, every day perhaps, certainly every year, in order to enjoy what there is around one. And for that reason, then, I'd say, take time off.
Stop being a slave to these.
And don't be addicted. And I know many people who are.
But on the other hand, let me just speak up for the opposite point of view, because, Brenda, isn't it sometimes the case that actually your first reaction to response can be more to the point, more focused, less verbose, and therefore more efficient? And actually, if you have more time, you just fill it with perhaps not always very useful thinking and consideration about your reply.
I think that depends on the personality and the individuals. Some individuals can give very good fast responses, others need more time to do that. I think that's very, very personality dependent.
Thank you very much. Well, we've heard from round the table, and if you're listening, do give us your view, a considered opinion, or an instant witty sharp retort. We'll take either. You can contact us via our webpage at bbcworldservice.com/forum, where you can also podcast the whole programme or explore the forum archive. You're listening to The Forum from the BBC World Service. Dr. Brenda Howard, you're a radio ecologist at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in the UK, and you specialise in the effect of radioactive contaminants on the life of our planet, and especially the non-human varieties, plants and animals. And for 20 years, your particular focus has been on the after effects of the Chernobyl nuclear explosion in 1986 in what was then the Soviet Union. Your concern, as I understand it, is that unlike other forms of contamination, pesticides and heavy metals, for instance, there are relatively few internationally agreed standards about how much radiation is acceptable for plants and animals, even though all countries have limits of radiation exposure for humans, but only a few, including the US, Canada, England, Wales and Sweden, go that step further and protect wildlife from radiation. So you say it's high time for an international agreement to protect wildlife everywhere. Why is this so important?
Well, I think the basic premise I have as working in an ecology organisation is that I think we should look at radionuclides in the same way as other contaminants. They are chemicals, they are elements. They happen to disintegrate radioactively, whereas some elements are stable, but they have similar modes of action, and they can harm cells and create problems for organisms. So I don't see why they should be treated differently from normal contaminants such as lead and pesticides.
Can you give us some examples of the way surreptitious radiation could be damaging plants and animals?
Well, I think with radiation, the effects that many people will be aware of are the acute effects that happen when you get very big exposures. And the obvious one that people will know about is the red forest in Chernobyl, where the pine trees died due to very high, short-lived exposure. But the thing that we are tending to focus on now is requiring ability to regulate on and set standards is for chronic low-level releases, such as those from nuclear industry or waste repositories, where we need to be able to set limits as to saying, well, this is a limit by which we think below this you won't have a problem. It's highly unlikely that there will be a problem with wildlife. Above that, you may need to think about it. You may need to do more.
And the point is that these radionuclides can have an incredibly long shelf life. So although they may be very tiny, they can be there for a very, very long time.
That's right. I mean, a radionuclide is literally an unstable element, but the rate at which it emits radioactivity varies tremendously. And some radionuclides have half-lives of seconds. So if you have 100 in 1 second, a few seconds later you'll only have 50 radioactive that radioactive element. Some of them have thousands of years, like plutonium. Their physical half-lives are thousands of years. So they'll be in the environment for a very, very long time.
And just explain to me, is your concern for the sake of wildlife the contamination possibly leading to species becoming extinct? Or is it because without the full picture of what's transferred to plants and animals, we can't understand what might happen to the food chain, the water, what might affect humans, whether we should drink cow's milk in a certain area or pick mushrooms or berries?
We have to go backwards a bit here. Radiation protection for humans has been the main focus for many, many years, for 50 years, because we knew that we had to protect humans from medical exposure, from workers in nuclear facilities, etc. We knew about the enormous effects of radiation from the atom bomb blasts. So there has been a quite understandable focus by the international community on protecting humans. And the International Commission for Radiological Protection issued statements to say that it believed that the safety rules that you have to protect humans very probably will also protect other wildlife, non-human biota, with a caveat that for humans you try to protect every single individual. And it might be the case that if you're protecting all individual humans, there may be some individuals for non-human species that might not be protected, but populations should be. Much of the focus, because of the focus on protecting humans, has been on quantifying how radionuclides behave in the food chain. So, for instance, we know an awful lot about how some radionuclides get into milk, especially iodine, which causes thyroid cancers. The radioiodine, which there was an awful lot of, came out of Chernobyl, gets into milk very, very quickly. And one of the key causes of the thyroid cancers around Chernobyl was contaminated milk. So the food chain has really been a focus for us. But in the last decade or so, people have started to question, that is it enough just to say if we protect man, we protect the environment? Surely we have to demonstrate that we are protecting the environment explicitly.
Tell me, Brenda, how relevant is your research to the current political moves there are to build more nuclear power stations all around the world as a way to stop relying on fossil fuels and combat global warming? Because surely there is a question of what risks might be posed by potential leakage for more and more and more nuclear waste storage sites into the soil and the water table, both actually for humans, but also particularly for wildlife in these areas.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I firmly believe, and it is increasingly becoming prevalent in national legislation, that there's a requirement to look at exposure of wildlife now. But I firmly believe that we will be able to demonstrate a much firmer base for the safety case for new facilities and waste repositories if we include environmental protection, which I think society would require anyway these days, that we don't just show that we protect man, but we also show that we can protect the environment.
But it could be quite a political hot potato if you show something different and show actually this is rather risky.
I actually think many radioecologists and people who actually do the estimates of exposure from new build, which is what we are starting to do. The Swedes, for instance, the company which is putting in a case to build the waste repository in Sweden, they are having to do the case not just for humans but also for biota, and that then will be assessed by the regulators. So it's already happening. It will help industry to be able to demonstrate explicitly that it is protecting the environment as well as just humans. And as long as we can provide industry with an inexpensive but good way to do that, which has reasonable predictions that are actually produced with reasonably good data, then it shouldn't be too expensive.
Sari Nusebi, listening in Jerusalem, what's your perspective on this?
If I may, I'd like to ask the question, what is required, for instance, for her to be able to succeed in bringing about agreement or consensus to get an international agreement to protect wildlife from radioactive contaminants?
That's a good question.
There is a project called Protect, isn't there, which you've been working on?
There have been a number of initiatives recently. One of the most important ones is the International Commission on Radiological Protection itself, which has actually now brought in the idea of protection of the environment itself in its new publications. And they have just published a book on a framework of how to do this. In the last few weeks, it's just out on the web. So the most important body in terms of radiation protection is now getting behind the suggestion and agreeing that there is a need to demonstrate that the environment is protected. The project I coordinated, called Protect, which was a European Union project, we looked at the same thing but rather from a different angle, because the International Commission has developed a framework which uses the similar principles to that for man. Man has something called reference man, which is a sort of typical man that it does the dosimetry for and the scientific calculations. And the group in the Commission now looking at protection of the environment has developed a series of reference animals and plants. To be similar to reference man, we are doing it in a rather different way in that we are looking at a wider group of reference organisms, but we are trying to do the assessment using the same approach as is used for the other chemical contaminants. So using the same quantitative methods as is used for pesticides and for metals, and using the same scientific procedures, the same use of experimental data to derive the standards that might be sent, the benchmarks against which we can say whether something is safe or not.
Just to try, Brenda describing her work, this gathering of data, it occurs to me that it's rather like a historian, rather like your work, isn't it? Looking for low-level and long-term effects, so that 20 years since Chernobyl actually isn't a very long time.
Oh, yes. I mean, new people would die because of Chernobyl, because they were in the wrong place when the radioactive fallout went out. And the French government said that there was a sort of barrier. So they, but I would like to put a question not as a historian but as a citizen. Not all scientists are on the good part. There are also the bad guys, and there are also governments manipulating think tanks trying to minimize the levels. So could you explain us the way to prevent ourselves from such thugs?
Okay, I don't think I could claim a good guy, and there are other bad guys elsewhere. But we're actually at a critical point now, because the ICRP has produced its report, providing a framework. Protect has also done a lot of work in trying to provide suitable tools that we can use. But at the moment, the International Atomic Energy Agency and the European Commission are both considering their basic safety standards, revisions of the basic safety standards. And in the IAEA context, the International Atomic Energy Agency, that depends on a discussion of all the UN member states that are signed up to the IAEA as to whether they want to include the environment and to what extent they will include protection of the environment in the basic safety standards. And those basic safety standards are what are followed by many, many countries around the world. So we are at a critical juncture at the moment in that ICRP has done some of the base work, various European projects have done some base work, the Canadians have done a huge amount of work on this, and the United States scientists, to name a few. But at the international level, we still don't have consensus of the need for environmental protection and the extent to which countries will be required to demonstrate that protection.
This is Justo's point, isn't it? How do you bring everyone up to the same gold standard? And I'm thinking back to the Chernobyl accident. I was in Chernobyl just a few years ago on the 20th anniversary, so that's 2006, and talking to people who lived there, even in the collecting of human data, it was clear this had been incredibly flawed and it was very uneven. And not surprisingly, actually, when you think this was the USSR and only a few years later it was to collapse and suddenly turn into three countries who not only weren't coordinating very well, but were pretty chaotic. But therefore it seems that in any context you always have a lot of guesswork and rumour, and some countries will just find it very difficult, quite expensive, to track the data to the same level that other countries would.
I have to take issue with you, Bridget. I think that the initial response to the accident in the USSR was very good. Mm-hmm. And from my point of view, from the radiology point of view, the USSR had a number of very experienced and very good radiologists. Now, the reason it had those was that the Windscale accident happened in 1957. 3 weeks later, there was an accident at Mayak. And there was a silo explosion in the Urals, in Russia. And there was an enormous amount of work. It was kept pretty secret for quite a long time. But the USSR had a wealth of experience in radiation protection and in radioecology because they put an enormous research effort into coping with the problems of this explosion, which were very long-term. Strontium-90 was one of the main radionuclides emitted. That has a physical half-life of 28 years. So if you have 1,000 becquerels per kilo in milk on day one, 28 years later you have 500. So it hangs around for a long time. And it's quite a mobile radionuclide. And they did enormous work on looking at this. Now, many of these people were still there in Mayak doing that work or in other institutes across the country. They were moved rapidly to Chernobyl when it happened. And they set about doing the things that were important, like stopping people drinking milk, setting systems up in collective farms so that the milk was not contaminated. Had a very big effect and really reduced the lot. But one of the things we realised over time, and particularly from about 1990 onwards, when we started working with those scientists, for instance, the European Union had collaborative projects with scientists in the former Soviet Union, was that there were actually, there are lots of private farmers, subsistence farmers, everybody in that rural community has their own cow, which is very important to them because that's where they get their milk, and the pigs. The transfer to milk of the private cows is relatively high, the transfer of radioactivity. And, whereas there was a lot of effort devoted to the collective farm and collective milk, which dramatically reduced the doses that people received, there were still these doses in the private cows, which actually provided quite a large proportion of the doses that led to thyroid cancers. So, I think, yes, there was a very good response from my perspective in my particular area of radiology, but they didn't cover all the bases totally to reduce the thyroid cancers, but it could have been a lot worse. So
you can always have different perspectives, of course. I just wanted to put this point to Sari Nusebi in the Middle East, this idea of a gold standard of international regulation. This is a part of the world that is preoccupied with quite a lot of other problems besides the transfer of radiation to plants and animals. As you're listening to this discussion, Sari, do you think this is something which could be picked up and applied there, or actually is that really very difficult to imagine?
No, it's not difficult to imagine. I think it's very important, actually, and I very much hope that whenever the time comes for an international agreement to be drawn up, that the Middle East will definitely be part of it. As you know, there's this nuclear plant now in Israel that is not has not been fitted into the general system for protection of human beings from this. And more generally, though, I'm just worried, actually, as I'm listening to Brendan. I think it's very important what she's saying. I'm feeling a little bit concerned, and I want to just ask the question: how much should we, in fact, be worried? Not just in the Middle East, where I am at the moment. Chernobyl was clear, but as you yourself said, there's something called surreptitious contaminants and radiation and so on. How dangerous is it, actually?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, I think that for the vast majority of normal operations of reactors and waste repositories, etc., I think that we would be very surprised if there are many cases where there are doses which would give us cause for concern. I think most of them will be screened out at a relatively...
Us meaning humans?
Well, yes. I mean, the doses, the expected doses to plants and animals, I think, are not going to be high. The important thing is to demonstrate that it's not a problem for new build and waste repositories. There are certain circumstances, like, for instance, in Canada at the moment, there's a particular focus on uranium mining. You know, and in countries where there's uranium mining in the past, there have been quite significant exposures to the uranium, you know, and in some cases there's the possibility that the uranium mining tailings may be having effects on the environment from past uranium mining facilities. And that's currently being looked at in a programme within the International Atomic Energy Agency, where we have some working groups where we're all talking about that and looking at those sorts of things, uranium mining. So there are specific circumstances where we think there may be effects, and we need to do more work to see whether those effects are actually there or not. One of the problems about radioactive contamination is it is often associated with the contamination by other chemicals. You know, uranium, for instance, is a case in point. Uranium emits radioactivity, but uranium as a chemical element itself is also toxic. No. So if you have an effect, is it due to the radioactive uranium or just uranium as a stable element, which we know can cause effect in organisms itself?
But to come back to the question that Justo asked a bit earlier, how are you going to get everybody to collaborate when there may be governments who think, well, you know, this uranium industry might be rather critical to their economy and they may not be too keen on international standards that might show something up?
I actually think that... the cooperation within contexts like the International Atomic Energy Agency helps tremendously because we can look together at the problem. We are doing, you know, there are lots of countries involved now in actually looking at these problems together. The assessment tool that has been developed in America and the one in the UK, in the European community are freely available. You can download them from the web. You can come to the agency. You can learn how to use them. And I think that increases confidence in the ability of people to do these assessments. And also we get international agreement on the outcomes.
One quick final question. How long do you think it would take to create a database that would allow you to make clear judgments? Not on all species, obviously, but enough to give an idea of whether we're missing something important.
OK, there are two key requirements for databases. One is an improved data on radiation effects on different types of organisms. We don't have enough data on that at the moment. And the other one is we need more data on the transfer of radionuclides from soil and water to different organisms. And we're actually producing that in the IAEA at the moment. We're producing a handbook on that, which should be published next year.
Brenda Hart, thank you. And now to you, Giusto Traina, Italian historian based at the University of Rouen in France and a specialist in late antiquity. And that's the focus of your latest book, a kaleidoscope look at what was happening across the Roman Empire in the apparently unspectacular year of 428 AD. But part of your idea in choosing this book was precisely because it wasn't a memorable year for some big event. You argue that looking at it in detail can give us a more realistic and varied view of how history unfolds, both in the empire's old centre and in the periphery.
Well, I always loved marginal questions. So marginal landscapes, marginal history, marginal people, because I think when you know the margins, it is better to understand the center in some way. When you have the guts to study the center anyway.
So define the edges, and then you can sort of tell a bit more about the whole thing.
Yes, basically, so marginality can be also an escape way in order to avoid the continuum of history. But in fact, this book was dictated by serendipity. I'm actually a specialist of Armenia, so the kingdom of Greater Armenia, which was active from 2nd BC to 428. So it was
so on the very edge of the Roman Empire, as you said, on the periphery.
Yes, it's between two empires, the Roman and the Persian Empire, and it was also on the edge of different kind of peoples, because you also have the nomads of the Caucasus and the people of Central Asia. So and Armenia was just in the middle of that. I decided to study the fall of the Kingdom of Armenia.
So this isn't really about the fall of the Roman Empire, it's the fall of the Armenian kingdom.
Yes, all the Roman Empire, but only a one-year history, because one-year histories exist, but not for antiquity.
So if I understand this rightly, this is about not looking at the connections in history through time, but the connection in history of what's happening at the same time.
At the same time.
You call it polycentric, don't you?
Yes.
Polycentric view of history.
This is polycentric.
Let's ask Sari Nusseibeh, sitting in Jerusalem, what do you make of this polycentric approach to history?
You know, it is absolutely right, of course, that if one looks at the edges, if one looks at the margins, if one looks at the areas where people have not really made that much of an impact, then, you know, one can perhaps get a larger picture of what's happening. But I want to say that, you know, as we often say, that history is written by people who sort of make it, not by the marginal edges, but by the centers. History, as we say normally, is written by the people who actually make history, the people who in fact come out as victors or conquerors. Now, in that kind of, in light of saying that, I find it very hard to understand, to explain to myself, sitting where I do in Jerusalem as a Palestinian, very hard to understand what's happening now to me. And I imagine looking back into history, for instance, at the particular year 428 AD, I find it doubly hard to understand what's happening then, whether one is looking at that in a polycentric way, as you said, or one is looking at that as part of a time continuum.
You're saying that because it makes
very hard.
It makes the world look more complicated. It doesn't help you.
It makes it much more complicated. I mean, I think it's difficult to look at things from the outside, which one is doing if one is looking at 428 AD. I think it's very hard to look at things, you know, at the time one is living. I mean, looking around and asking oneself exactly what's happening. I think history writing is just very, very hard.
I suppose what you're saying...
I sympathize with you.
Yeah, I suppose what you're saying, sorry, and I suppose I would agree in general as a layperson. I don't know if Brenda agrees, that we look to history to try and help us make some sense of the past, to look for stories. And that inevitably means joining up the dots. And usually it is in a linear fashion, as a narrative, as a story.
But often the history you learn for a longer continuum is those of the dominant communities at that time. So you get a very biased history because it's the history of the victors or the
So you're
strong.
quite sympathetic to this,
Yes.
Brenda? Justo.
Well, yes, a conqueror has the means to write history. But there are also, I know at least two cases when the defeated people can write a better history. The first one is the case of Armenia. Armenian literature, Armenian historiography starts after the fall of the kingdom. And the second one is the Italy of the Renaissance. There was no such thing as Italian identity at the time. In a Renaissance where the powers were France and Spain, Italy was a non-existent political entity, but on the other hand, a cultural entity which still matches our civilization. So it's not so easy to speak about philosophy or history, but maybe there are two cases which can make us reflect.
I'm afraid that's where we've run out of time. We're going to have to draw the programme to a close. My thanks to all three of you, Italian historian Giusto Traina, Palestinian philosopher Sari Nusseibeh, and British radio ecologist Brenda Howard. The address for our website is bbcworldservice.com/forum, where you can hear the programme again, find links to our podcast, archive of earlier programmes, and how to get in touch. Coming up next week, the subjects will be time as a moral battleground, how vastly different organisms navigate to a very similar biological conclusion, and how a supergrid could achieve instant cuts in our carbon emissions. And meanwhile, I am off to Australia and New Zealand to record some special forum programmes there. And you can follow my progress by going to our forum Facebook page. But for now, from me, Bridget Kendall, and everyone on the forum, have a good week.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.